Yeah, the moderator mentioned Tapa, not a city in Estonia here, but they don't have an adult education school there. Hello from my side also. When I already had said yes to Sirje that I'm coming here to speak on this topic, then I came to the realization that maybe I shouldn't just blurt out yes so easily. Because on the one hand, this is a topic that seems, especially maybe to the people in this hall here today, as if it's something very natural. On the other hand, however, it's a very complicated topic because it's very easy to get emotional within this. We all know what's being discussed here, and so I think it might make sense to take a look at this understanding that as a parent, your education also influences the way your children cope in life. Is it just something that people say, or is it actually true? What does research say about it? What do studies say about it? And it's also a complicated topic because when we're talking about people, and when we talk about topics that are very closely connected to people themselves, then we can't just flat out say that it is like that and it's always like that, because I'm pretty sure we all have examples to the contrary we can bring from our own personal lives. It can be that very highly educated parents have children that have setbacks in their lives, and on the other hand, there's cases where children are born into a very complicated situation, but they can find their way out of these situations. So with a topic such as this, we can talk about this 2080 principle again. We do have examples that may not support what we're saying today, but quite often it's still, if we take a random grouping of 100 or 1,000, then for example, in the case of 1,000, then it happens that 800 out of them might be just as you'd expect. But keep an open mind. If we have examples to the contrary, then of course we also have examples that say exactly the same. People coping in their lives is very much connected to their education. Not always, not everywhere, but still very often and to a great degree. How people have done at school, whether they've been successful, whether they enjoyed learning, whether they managed well. And this, in turn, the fact whether they did well in school or not, is still very closely connected to what their home life is like, what their parents' experience with learning has been. And here's a couple of slides to keep our feet on the ground and keep us straight focused on relatively new studies. One that has been spoken about quite a lot and which has been popularized and has been interpreted by Aune Valk quite a lot. It's the PIAC study, which most of us should be acquainted with. And there's a lot of information on the Ministry of Education's webpage concerning the PIAC results, but one of the key findings was that if the mother as well as father have a higher education, it ends both of them on average add at least 1 year of additional studies to the child's school career. And in Estonia, the good news is that the Estonian schools are strong enough that the influence here might be smaller than in many other countries. So even children from a disadvantaged background, generally with the support of a good school and a good teacher, can find their footing in life and can find their place. But this is the general rule. This is what the PX studies at least have shown. And another study is from OECD, how the parents have influenced, how parents influence children's education. The OECD is you could call it a rich countries club, which Estonia is a member of since 2010. And they say that there is a direct correlation between the parents' education and how well kids do in school. But not only. There's also a direct correlation, or it's also very important how the parents, or a very important factor is the parents' attitude and support. For example, how well children manage and do in school and how much they read is very much influenced by what they see at home, whether they see their parents reading a book. Not that mandatory reading is important and you actually do that, but whether they even see their parents reading books and whether there are books at home, whether children are being read to, whether you read with children together, and also things such as whether a child has been to a library together with their parents. It's not just talking about how important learning is, it's more about what these little citizens of the world actually see at home. This is something that they will incorporate into their own lives once they grow up. The same OECD study also showed that the kids that can discuss the things of the world with their parents at home, and it doesn't mean that they necessarily talk about politics, but whether they can actually just discuss things with their parents, these children have more interest towards the world. They read more, learning is interesting for them, and it's more interesting. And if it is more interesting, then they are more likely to succeed at it. This is what the OECD studies have shown. The Estonian Human Development Report from 2014-15 brings in another key word, which is the cultural capital. This cultural capital is, again, the same things that our OECD study also showed, whether there are books at home, whether kids are being read to and read with, whether the kids are taken to the museums, theaters, whether there's things done together. And we say that this cultural capital is very closely connected to the education level of the parents, as well as their profession. And not to get emotional, I just brought 3 relatively dry examples from 3 different studies. And when talking about coping and managing in life, then in order to cope in life and also in the working life, like we heard before, 5 different careers throughout your life, etc. But in order to actually start working on these 5 careers, you need to learn new things, you need to keep adding new things, you need to relearn certain things. Then maybe repeating what Kairi Solman also said at the beginning of the day, the numbers I have is also from the same report from Estonia. It's something that all educators actually know quite well, is that this the differences between those that have a secondary education, have a basic education, they don't usually take part in further training, but those that have a higher education, they generally go for another master's degree, go to different training courses, are able and willing to learn new things, and they enjoy it. They don't just do it because it's demanded of them. This brings me to my next thought. If you quit on education too early, then it doesn't influence a person's life not only for a few years, but actually it influences their entire life up until retirement, whenever that may come. And within this context and in front of this background, if we look back at the beginning of the 90s, the era of regaining our independence, the statistics were relatively dire looking. These new times, new schools had at least a few hundred dropouts every year. In even the worst years, it was more than 1,000. And these are parents nowadays. These people are now parents. The ones that dropped out of schools in the 90s didn't leave our planet. They are still right here. And more likely than not, they have children. And those that today, in 2017, didn't go to the university, and aren't going to university next year, or even if they do, they drop out halfway through. These people will be parents in the future. It's certainly not the case that everyone in Estonia needs to have a higher education, and only in those cases children will be successful in their lives. I'm sure there are a lot of people that are very good at their everyday lives. They're good. They work well. They do the best so that their children will do well in their lives. But there's another interesting study, or actually there's plenty of interesting studies, but a study says that the higher education a person has, the more positive their outlook in life is, the less danger they have of befalling to depression. But then again, of course, you probably know people with a higher education that have mental health issues, but in general it seems as if people with a lower level of education also sees their own future in a more a negative light, and they also see the same for their children, as opposed to those that have a broader view of the world. So in any case, a lot of it has to do with the fact that if I have more education, then of course I can support my child in a more efficient manner. And this is also a lot of why people go back to school. During my work at the Tartu Adult Education School, then every year I see people or examples where people say that they couldn't help their kids that go to 5th grade, cried out of anger and disappointment and came back to school. They came to the realization that if they want to keep supporting their children in the future, they need to go back and study. And another example from a conversation with a young lady, and she probably didn't even realize how profound her words were, but she said, how do I tell my child how important learning is, and be good, and you need to be respectful of your children or teachers, etc. But at some point the kid won't believe me anymore if I don't have finished my education. And another case, there, a young man, he had a very good job, he was creative, he was a very, he's a very, he's very good at what he does. He has two young sons at home. But at some point he came to the realization, he realized that if he wants to keep doing what he's doing at even a better level, he wanted to go and keep studying at the Viljandi Cultural Academy. And on the other hand, two young sons at home who he wanted to be an influence for, he decided he's going to come back to school. He came to high school, he finished it, and he went on to study at the university. When he graduated, he took his children, he showed them where their dad sat, etc. And you could see that the kids were proud. And quite often that when children go back, parents go back to school, usually the children are very supportive of it. They're willing to clean up after themselves, not to disturb their mom, and let mom focus. And also the cases where parents and children study together. There are a lot of great examples. I have one more slide. This is for the adult educators. My message here could be, how do we get people back to school? This negativity doesn't work, and aren't you ashamed? Go back to school, you need to be an influence to your children. There's no point in nagging. Everyone is an expert at their own lives. But since there's a lot of adult educators in this room today, then my plea to the educators, but also everyone else, also kindergarten teachers, everyone that has access to people, everyone that has the option of passing this message on, this quiet but very steady work towards the realization that studying, learning is very important for you as well as your children, and that you can actually influence your children's lives by learning. It doesn't matter what type of course people go to. Is it nail technician, or is it an engineer, or whatever? Then this general idea of being a positive role model to your children by learning is key. I know we all do it anyway, but let's hope we all do it even more. Let's hold on to this focus. And I'm very happy that, especially also during this agenda program, also in kindergartens, we have this way of approaching the parents. And again, also those that have already come to the realization that learning is fun, then pass it on. Don't say, go back to school. Rather say, what would be if you would? And this is, in brief, my brief little summary, supported by a couple of studies, and it holds true. What you learn is always beneficial.